So, since the book is so small and the chapters are so small, they're tiny, tiny 5-minute chapters. So, I'm thinking let's read at least for half an hour. So that way we can finish the book in approximate 6 videos. And also, we can read more chapters. Let's see how that goes. Chapter 12, The Lewis Club, continued. I messaged Hilltop Lewis and told her I would bring bread to the next meeting of the Lewis Club. I'm so glad you're coming back, she replied. We are afraid we might have scared you off. Flashy Lewis can be a bit much. It was nice to know we each had our own system for Lewis disambiguation. Who was I to them? Young Lewis, I suppose, better than boring Lewis or Lewis whose stomach hurt. In fact, my stomach had been feeling pretty good lately. So it came to pass that the Lewises of San Francisco Bay Area built open-faced sandwiches, piling prosciutto and fig over soft slathers of goat cheese all atop slices of my bread. They ate all of it, every crumb, and they owed their appreciation. I have been baking bread for 20 years, Professor Lewis said, and it never turned out this good. My starter is unique, I said. She nodded. I get mine in the mail from King Arthur, the flour company. Every 3 months it dies, and I order a new one. The Lewises shared their updates. Compact Lewis was organizing a fundraiser for a turkey vulture research center. Professor Lewis had just returned from an academic conference in Montreal. Impeccable Lewis would soon acquire a vintage Moog synthesizer for a very good price, and old Lewis was still alive. I told the Lewises about my baking adventures. They interrupted to say, It's really great, and truly, Lewis, dear, you have a gift, and also about Chef Kate's challenge. I love the farmer's market, Professor Lewis cooed. You should do it. The other Lewises nodded in agreement. Compax Lewis spoke. Her voice was not kind or coddling, but stern. Do you like your job? My hesitation answered for me. I know I have strong opinions about everything. I can't help it. I do. But this one's the strongest. I waited too long to get out of that office. Much too long. I weep for those years. The seriousness of her statement quieted the room. If this is fun for you, and I think it is fun for you, damn, you're good at it. You should try out for those markets. See what happens. The other Louises murmured their assent. Everyone wore inward looks, perhaps contemplating the things they wished they'd done sooner. Thanks, I'd appreciate the advice. The wine was gone, so Hilltop Lewis, wearing a mischievous look, uncorked a bottle of port. I got the sense this did not happen at every meeting of Lewis Club, but the ones at which it did, those were the good ones. I envy you, Lewis the younger, sighed Compact Lewis. No, no, she's Computer Lewis, said Hilltop Lewis. We all have names? Who am I? Old Lewis interjected. There was a pause. You are the most respected elder Lewis, said Impeccable Lewis, who today was wearing a tweed suit tailored close to her body with pleats of intimidating sharpness. Old Lewis sniffed. I don't like it. Anyway, I think she was to be Lewis the baker now. The bread was awfully good, Compact Lewis agreed. She flipped the last remaining sliver of fig into her mouth and looked at me pointedly. See what happens, she said. The setting sun lit the house in orange and pink, and it made all the Lewises look great. Emerging from bathroom, I caught a glimpse of myself in a hallway mirror. My hair was longer than it had been in years, and it glowed in the sunset, the ends alight like burning filament. Louis the baker looked great too. Cars appeared. One was from the Expedient Internet car service, and Compact Louis waved as she stepped in, her bralets glittering. The other cars were piloted by various Lewis associates. Professor Lewis's husband read The Atlantic while he waited. Old Lewis's daughter helped her into the passenger seat of a Toyota, laughing at some quiet joke. Impeccable Lewis's girlfriend drove an old Ford pickup truck. On top of the city, with my Lewises all around me, I felt a tremor of something. Was it possible? I had become interesting. From below. I keep writing the mask like it's a definite thing. In fact, leopard Leopold, my father, is Dutch. Sharia's mother was Italian. Truthfully, Shemin and I could, if we wanted, decide not to be mass. I have a cousin who did that. She makes dresses in Barcelona now. But Sherman and I have attachments. For me, it's food, and for Sherman, it's the music. And for the both of us, it's Sharia who is mass through and through, whatever that means. We are both always trying to impress her and not disappoint her, which can be a tricky combination. So that's the end of chapter 12, along with Burek's email. Now we're moving on to chapter 13. The greenest of all markets. I'd never seen so many pickles in my life. We were lined up, hundreds of us, all with our samples like offerings for a queen or a newborn prophet. Boxes and baskets and bottles and jars. So many jars. Some jars plain, others with clever labels already designed and printed in anticipation of a bright future at one of the Bay Area's many markets. Not all of those labels would be needed. The woman in front of me was clutching a jar of Japanese pickled plums between her breasts, staring into space, moving her lips, sub-vocalizing, rehearsing. Behind me was another woman who seemed somewhat more serene. She'd brought a tall bottle of olive oil, labeled with a strip of masking tape that read Picolin. In a cardboard carrier, she had 8 tiny blue tasting glasses shaped like tulips. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she said, her eyes roaming the space. The ferry building was more than amazing. It was mythic. This grand structure on the city's edge, perched on pylons built 100 years ago, and in the middle of that century, not merely abandoned, but actually walled off by a dark freeway that curled around the Embassado like a rampart. Then an earthquake came, and it was something like out of a fairy tale. The walls tumbles, the spell fades, and the townspeople realize what a gift they have possessed all along. The ferry building was rebuilt, reopened. It was better than ever. And best of all, on Saturdays, when it unfurled itself into a farmer's market that piled up the plazas, reached out onto the piers, trucks converged from 100 miles in every direction, carrying fruit, nuts, vegetables, flowers, fresh meat, the whole bounty of California. The sun glittered on the bay, and big brick bridge to Oakland bracketed the scene like a picture frame. This was the greatest of all markets, and basically no one in this line had a chance of getting a spot here. I had learned this online, searching for information about the tryout. You started on the periphery and made your way to the bright, bustling core. It was Wednesday, so there was no market. But even during the week, the ferry building was prodigious hub of gastronomical commerce. We petitioners were lined up on a catwalk above the building's main concourse where shops sold cheese and chocolate, beef and beans, knives and cookbooks, and garden gloves. Midday sunshine streamed in through skylights that ran the length of the building. Tourists and locals alike gathered around green light coffee, watching the baristas take their time. In San Francisco, there is a particular trajectory available to food related enterprises. Your little venture, maybe it's called Green Light Coffee, begins with a ramshackle cart at the outermost corner of a far-flung farmers market, comma market of the dead. In a year or two, having established your dedication, you are invited to the ferry building. This is your audition. The right person sees you, and the right person is assuredly here, canvassing the stalls, and you are springboarded, granted a small storefront in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. If the storefront is successful, if it is as if it assists with the greater aims of gentrification, is written up in the national food and or lifestyle publications, including ideally the New York Times, the local paper can't help you here. Then you will be permitted to open a larger, more boldly designed flagship along one of the city's centrified cool thoroughfares. If in a few years, you will have expanded into a few additional locations, including a permanent spot in the ferry building, a gleaming cafe bathed in the midday light. You will have become a celebrated local mini chain. Finally, you will sell your company to Starbucks for $19 million. And remember, you began with the cart all at the outermost corner. You began here, in this time. That's why I was petitioner number 43, with more people behind me than in front. This tryout occurred once a month. We would have had better odds applying to Stanford as adult learners. When I reached the front of the line, a bright eyed ferry building functionary explained that I was about to experience what I was about to experience. The deal, she said, was this: 3 minutes with the panel, offer a taste, just a taste. Explain what makes you different, be eloquent but concise, but confident but differential. Much of this is beyond your control. If you make pickles, but the markets are overflowing with them, it won't matter how great your pickles are. The woman with the Japanese pickled plums was inside now. The loaf I had baked this morning had cooled completely, and suddenly I wished I'd carried it in some kind of insulating sleeve. But then, I supposed it might have turned soft. How do you store and transport bread? I didn't know anything. That was the absurdity of this. I was standing in the line with people who were masters of their craft, people who pickled plums, pressed olives, raised chickens, kept bees. I was just lucky, gifted with good raw materials and perhaps charitably a sense for how to use them. The Clement Street starter was waiting back at my desk. Smells good, the functionary said, catching a whiff of the bread. I wished suddenly that I'd brought the starter itself. I wished I'd trained it to sing on command. I could have put it in front of the panel and said, "Have you ever seen anything like this?" The functionary explained that the panel would taste my sourdough and hear my plea, then announce its market's placements later in the afternoon. Placement was conditional on my willingness to sign certain agreements and also on certain logical double checks, that she, the functionary, would make. If I wasn't placed anywhere, well, most of the people in this line had been turned down many times already. You can always try again, the functionary said. You were allowed to return once a season. People applied and reapplied, grovelled and waited for years. The green light coffee people had done that. $19 million. The door opened. The pickler of plums emerged, her face a tangle of vexations. I tried to catch her eye to give her an encouraging look, but she was all wrapped up in herself, carrying her jar towards the stairs that would lead her down to main concourse, where perhaps she would acquire a cone of cardamom ice cream to assuage to assuage her anxiety. The bright-eyed functionary held open the door to the panel's chamber, and wished me good luck from below. Tonight, Shaman and I counted through all the places we've ever lived: Brussels, Budapest, Turin, Avignon, Edinburgh, San Francisco. That's six. About average for a couple of miles. I don't know if I should count Edinburgh twice. Now that we are back here, Shaman's favorite city is San Francisco, for sure. He's shouting. I don't think I've found mine yet. So that's the end of chapter 12. Now are at chapter 13. Um, the Pantheon. Okay. The room was wide and windowed, with a blinding view of the bay. Yerba Buena Island directly ahead. 7 judges sat in a line at a long table, 4 women and 3 men, swaddled and comfortable, wrapped in scarves and kaftans, plain fabrics, generous cuts. They had different colored skins and different colored hair, but they shared a satisfied plumpness. It looked like a committee of harvest gods drawn from all the pantheons, all except one seated at the end of the table who seemed less Demeter or Dionysus, more Hades. Her hair was shiny and slicked back, She wore a slouchy black leather jacket over a shimmering black t-shirt. Maybe she was the token goddess of deaths and also of street fashion. Welcome, the gods murmured together. What do you have for us today? They were smiling, apple cheeked, with friendly wrinkles around their eyes. They were wide framed and bold and whiskered. They didn't seem like cruel, uncompromising judges at all. Even the queen of underworld was smiling. Let's have a taste, they said. There was a bread knife waiting in a tray alongside other knives, as well as spoons and cups, the instruments of ritual. Using the ferry building knife, I sawed 7 generous slices. Tell us about this bread you've made, they said. We do have many bakers already. But Jacqueline, you never know. The inner sunset could use a good sourdough. That's a fair point, Marco. Let her speak. Tell us about it. It's unique, I said. That's why I brought it. Sourdough depends on its starter, right? This starter is special, and I thought you would appreciate it. A bit of flattery. They really thought he would appreciate. They received it well. There was fluttering and cooing, and those with whiskers stroked them. I watched them eat. They did so carefully, all at their own pace. They sniffed the bread, flipped it over, tore it into smaller pieces. One gray haired goddess held it up to the light, peering through the crumb of the bread as if it were stained glass window. This is good, they said. Very good indeed. But we do have bread already. We have many fine sourdoughs. Is this superior? Is there a market where it fits? A bearded god of wine and festivals, asked pointedly, to what baking tradition would you say this belongs? That stumped me. I would have been very comfortable lying, but I didn't know anything about any baking traditions at all. I was about to say I learned from every room, but I stopped myself. Every baker who walked into this chamber must have learned from every room. Actually, I work at a tech company, I confessed. General dexterity. Do you? Okay, no. I served this in the cafeteria there, and Chef Kate, I mean, Kate, I realized I didn't know her last name. Kate Rossi, said the goddess of the dead. Did she send you here? That's interesting. From beneath a luxurious bread came a gentle query. From beneath a luxurious beard came a gentle query. A tech company, you said. Are you technical? I told them I was a programmer. And which do you prefer, baking or programming? Do I have to choose? You might, they said. The day may come. Lake Merritt, it's very busy. It demands everything of a vendor. Do you think she's right for Lake Merritt? Oh, no, 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 no. I was just making a point. The central goddess, a woman wrapped in a light blue shawl, had been silent. Now she quieted tiniest motions, the rest of the tiniest motions of her hand, and barely nibbled the bread. There was no charity in her eyes, and she looked at me and said, "That will be all." Okay, I said. Thanks. Thank you for bringing this to us, they said. Thank you for bringing yourself. Later, I was waiting for announcements, walking in circles around the perimeter of the ferry building. 2 licks into a cone of soothing pistachio ice cream, then a voice called out to me, "You, with the bread." Me with the bread? It was the queen of the underworld. She stood in the shadow of the pillars that supported the ferry building's great roof, smoking a cigarette, looking exquisitely renegade. She was positioned precisely 1 inch beyond the sign that demarcated the building's no smoking zone. General dexterity makes robots, right? I turned to tell her yes, the company designed industry leading robot arms and laboratories, and you program the robot arms and you bake bread. That's right, I said. Interesting, is it? Oh, definitely. People here tend to go the other way. They're suspicious of technology. A jag of excitement skittered through my chest. Was this a hint? Do you think I'll get a spot? She lifted her head in what I thought was going to be the beginning of an affirmative nod, but instead her chin just hung there as she regarded me quietly. We'll see. The pickle producers and miscellaneous others all gathered on the main concourse as the ferry building's giant clock bonged the hour. Three echoing bongs. The bright-eyed functionary was standing on the catwalk above, and she read off names like a herald, calling out the Queen's decrees. I surveyed the crowd. Some faces were plainly tortured with anxiety, on the verge of tears and or unconscious. Others appeared placidly pessimistic. Gilroy, the functionary called out. The farthest market, she began, reading names and products. Sonja, Tarkovsky, tea. There was a little whoop from the very back of the crowd. Hundreds of eyes whipped around to find Sonja, some glittering with envy, others with naked malice. The list went on. Alex and Graham and Jenna, cheese and coffee and bread. I haven't started the bread. As the crowd shrank, the stakes grew higher. The list was involving north and west from was moving from north and west from Gilroy to Los Altos and to Colma. A sausage marker slotted there emitted a quiet groan. From Orinda to Moranga to Lake Merritt, closer and closer to the ground on which we stood. Each vendor accepted, made his or her way to the table positioned beside the heirloom bean emporium to receive an orientation packet. The rest of us waited as the market grew more prestigious and the list grew shorter. At this point, I maintained no illusions. I would not be chosen. The functionary came to the end. For the ferry building farmers' market, the crowd was silent, levitating an inch off the ground. We have no selections at this time. Everyone on the concourse exhaled together, withering disappointment mixed with clean, clear relief. The crowd disintegrated. The force holding it taut was spent, but the functionary wasn't finished. There's one more, she called out. Most people ignored her. A few turned curious faces towards the catwalk. What could possibly follow the ferry building? For the Marrow Fair, she said. We have one selection. No one cared. Never heard of it. Louis Clary, sourdough bread. It barely registered with any of the others, who were all caught up in celebration or mourning. What was the Marrow Fair? I stared at the functionary. I wasn't sure how to feel. Excitement and confusion were ducking it out, with horror quietly circling the rim. The functionary caught my gaze and pointed to the table by the beams where the queen of the underworld waited. I was so confused. I didn't know what questions to ask. Was it real? Was it worth my time? Where was it? Hello, Baker, the queen of underworld said. You were selected for one of the main markets, which means I am free to make an offer. I'm Lily Velasco. I manage the Marrow Fair. What is the Marufet? She fished something out of her leather jacket. It looked like what was left after you finish a chicken drumstick. But when I accepted it, I realized it was a real bone. It wasn't a real bone. Instead, it was made from beige plastic. Some kind of high grade polymer, warm and smooth, almost buttery. There was a ring attached to the end of it, as if you dangled it from a keychain. That's the key to my market, Lily Velasco said. This offer is contingent, but I want you to see the place before you decide. Contingent on what? I'll send you directions. Just come visit, then decide. From view. A lot of mask work in kitchens because, not to sound too haughty, but we are really good at it. All the restaurants with Michelin stars where you go and eat salted moss and turnip foam, I guarantee you will find mask working there. I did that in Edinburgh before at a really excellent restaurant. The owner just found out I was back and asked me if I would wanted to return. I turned it down nicely. I decided to open my own restaurant like in San Francisco, but this time I'm not going to be cautious about it. I'm going to be so mass. Louis, I'm telling you before anyone else, I'm going to have tables. So that's the end of chapter 13. Now we are going to read chapter 14, Almeda. It was 7 p.m. when I was slunk out of the office with the Clement Street starter in its ceramic prop. Instead of heading home, I walked around the curve of the Embarcado to the ferry building. This time my destination wasn't the Bombay arcade inside. but the piers beyond. I boarded the boat bound for the skinny island, shouldered up against Auckland on the far side of the bay, Almeida. The trip was shorter than I expected. Soon we were passing the port of Auckland and its loading cranes. They looked like the bleached skeletons of prehistoric portraits, Godzilla scale, with monstrous pulleys in their guts lifting bright containers out of long freighters that dwarfed the ferry. We bumped up against the dock at Almeda. I disembarked onto a wide parking lot, now mostly empty, and hiked up the road toward the coordinates I had been given. I never set foot on Almeda before. It had once been home to a sprawling naval base, but that had been decommissioned decades ago, and what remained in its place was a weedy moonscape dotted with military scale buildings inhabited by small businesses like hermit crabs in overlarge shells. I passed distillery, a furniture emporium, and a drone manufacturer, each in its own aircraft hangar. I stopped to check my directions. Yes, keep walking, Lily Velasco had written. Behind the hangars there was a huge expanse of abandoned asphalt, cracked and overtaken by vegetation. There were tall grasses and low tight shrubs with grey green leaves and bright white blossoms. I walked across the broken surface, feeling illicit, but there were no fences, no signals telling me to keep out. It seemed derelict. I passed a hangar turned brewery. This was Algebra, whose beers I'd tasted at fancy bars in San Francisco. Their flagship brew was the Esquire Saison. Out on the airfield, a herd of bulls were grazing. They bleated and cried and retreated as I approached, little bells jingling around their necks. It was an unexpected sight. The goats scattered across the vast empty asphalt, gnawing on the patchy grass, and behind them the mirrored quadruped forms of cranes snuffing their noses in the hold of the great freighters. Maybe the cranes would also be improved by bells around their necks. Among the goats there were two tall figures. One was an alpaca, the another stood in the center of the flock, its gray striking me coolly. The other figure was a young man with a rumpled sticker look. I waved as if signaling a ship and called out to him, "Hello?" The man waved lazily, but remained as silent and baleful as his alpaca complies. They both cast very long shadows. "I am looking for a market," I shouted, standing there on the asphalt. It seemed like an absurd statement. He nodded slowly at this. We were still standing very far apart. The man's aspect and the alpaca's were approximately equivalent, very not unfriendly, but fundamentally alien. After a long pause, the man pointed toward the old control tower. I waved again and walked in that direction. When I reached the tower, its front door was popped open. I poked my head inside. It appeared long abandoned, scrapped clean of furniture and ornament. Spiraling metal steps uh, wo- wound their way upward, wound their way upward. Climbing them, I found myself on the tower's bulbous deck with a panoramic view of the airfield and the island and the bay. The window's edge was decorated through all 360 degrees with beer bottles, all with algebra labels. The last of the day's sunlight filtered through them, casting blobs of green light around the room. The spiraling metal steps returned me to the tower's front door, and also continued down into the ground. There was a landing below. I descended and found another door, this one locked tight, blank and grey, except for a palm-sized outline stenciled in creamy white paint. The stencil's shape looked like what was left after you finished a chicken drumstick. The door offered no knob, no handle, no doorbell, no speakeasy slit. I tried to knock, but the metal hurt my knuckles. I thumped it with my palm, nothing. I drew out the buttery plastic bone token I had received at the ferry building and pressed it against the stencil. From unseen speakers, a synthesized voice bellowed like a buzz saw. Still, too skinny, and the door opened. From view. While I was in San Francisco with Shaman, I sometimes had the thought that perhaps the two of us were like the bacteria from the fungus in the starter, a tiny, self sufficient community. In that analogy, I am the bacteria and Shaman is the fungus. Never tell him I said that. Shaman had hardly come out of his room anymore. He's working on his album non-stop. He's been talking about it for 2 years. But something happened after we left San Francisco. He got serious. He follows all the excruciatingly cool music. I don't even understand where he finds it. And he says, mass singing will blow their minds. He's taking the old recordings, cutting them up, transforming them, and of course, adding a beat. He loves making the beats. The bacteria stands alone. That's the end of chapter 14. Now, the last chapter of this video, chapter 15, Pink Light. I walked into a space that was long and narrow, with the powdered down gloom of a high school at night. A raw concrete concourse with portals all along its edges. Bars of pink light streamed in the form of portals and made me think of the prom spilling out of the gym. Except here there were many proms and many gyms, and all were silent. The smooth floor was marked with stripes of paint that had flaked into segments, directions that no one had followed in a long time. It felt also like an empty spaceship, and a rule: you do not enter an empty spaceship without first knowing the fate of the crew. But the floor offered fresher directions too, extending away from the door. Long strips of yellow tape marked an angling path, and along that path workstations were set up, built from unstained lumber, bolted across metal frames, supporting kitchen gear and lab equipment. Some workstations had ranges with burners chunky like the grills of semi trucks. Ventilation hoods whirred softly. Where was the crew? The workstations had a rough and ready look, but this was no shanty town. The floor gleamed. I saw shoe prints over the swirled track of a mop. Power cords snaked across the yellow tape road, rooted securely beneath plastic channels. The arrangement was improvised but not anarchic. There was a power grid. There was a plan. I stepped off the yellow tape road to investigate one of the portals and its prom light. Beyond there was a squarish space about as big as my apartment. The far wall marked A3 in paint with the same level of flakage as the strips on the floor, and both sides of the room were packed with bushy vegetables in trays of on tall tracks fitted with lights, blaring fuchsia. Was that lettuce? Kale? The greens looked black in the weird light. The next portal opened into the room, A4, which definitely held broccoli. Cauliflower? No, broccoli. When I turned back to the concourse, it took me a moment for my eyes to adjust. I heard the hum of air circulation, the chirp of unseen electronics, and above the hum, below the chirp, I detected murmurs, voices, the crack of laughter. I returned to the yellow tape road, passing more workstations and more pink light portals on both sides, and in one place a line of glass-faced industrial refrigerators grumbling and clicking. The road ran straight through them, like a grocery store freezer aisle. The refrigerators were full of tubs and boxes, all with handwritten labels. I shivered. Ahead the road bent sharply around a line of enormous planter boxes supporting bushy dark-leafed trees, their branches heavy with lemons. Above them the ceiling broke open and admitted a cylinder of hazy sunlight through a smudgy grid of glass. On the other side of the pop-up lemon grove, I found the crew, dozens strong, all sitting together at a super long picnic table, talking and eating. Tattoos splashed on wrists and forearms as they passed dishes and poked forks. Men and women, mostly young, but a few with grey hair or bald heads. Near the middle of the table, a figure rose. It was the queen of the underworld, in her slouchy black leather jacket, Lily Velasco. Baker, she called. A few heads swiveled, and those few regarded me amiably. Velasco beckoned, and I went to her. Holding my bone key token in front of me, I approached as if it were an amulet of protection. You invited me here, I said, a reminder and also maybe an accusation. Velasco wickled her hands, and the people sitting across from her scooched apart dutifully. I wedged myself between a man and a woman. The man, who was broad-bellied and round-cheeked, began building a plate. The woman, who was as tiny as an elf, reached for an unlabeled growler and filled a jam bar with dark beer. "This is Louis," Velasco said to everyone within earshot, "a very talented baker." This was followed by silence. I got the sense maybe everyone within earshot was a very talented baker. Velasco continued. "She also programs robots." The hat raised an eyebrow from the elf girl and a few murmurs of interest farther down. "Louis, this is Horace, the round-cheeked man who managed the bookstore at the Ferry Building before joining us as our— What are you, Horace?" "The archivist?" "Librarian," Horace said neatly. "And this is Ori, the elf who sells cheese." I looked down at the plate Horace had built for me: brown rice and green onions and sesame seeds, dark glistening grease, a curl of what appeared to be octopus. I'd never eaten octopus. I looked at Lily Belasco. "What is this place?" She waved the question away. "First eat." Gracie was just showing us her new acquisition. She turned to the woman next to her, white framed with dark freckles, who cupped a jar on the table in front of her. "Chernobyl honey," Gracie said. "Surely not Belasco stuff." Gracie nodded firmly. "It's gone back to nature," she explained, "and the bees, they filter out the radioactivity." "Most enough." She unscrewed the jar, offered a taste. Velasco dipped her spoon and lifted it, trailing a strand that seemed to glow faintly, put it between her lips, let it sit. Her eyes glittered. "Try it," she said to all of us seated around her. "Try it, try it." The elf Oli dipped her spoon. Horace dipped his, too, and from his from him the Chernobyl honey earned a rumble of appreciation that was conducted by the bench into the soft flesh of my thighs. The Gracie tipped the jar towards me. "Try some, Baker." The gesture was solicitous, but her eyes glittered childish. In every legend of the underworld there is the same warning: don't eat the food, not before you know what's happening and or what bargain you're accepting. Along the length of the table, white dishes bobbed up and down, orbiting the currents of camaraderie. I saw faces smiling and serious, all lit by the hazy light from above, but hallowed with pink from the portals on both sides. Across the table, Lily Blasco watched me with dark eyes. I'd come this far. I dipped my spoon. From below. In San Francisco, there was an older woman, a Russian, the sister of Sharia's landlord in Brussels, from long ago, back before either Shaman or I was born. I'm laughing here because this is how every mass story starts. My old landlord. The masks are inveterate renters. Anyway, this Russian owns many buildings on 7th Street. She offered us an apartment, but the kitchen had no oven, just a hot plate. And when we asked for a different one, she said, "You're going to get me in trouble." But she couldn't refuse, because many years ago Sharia did something very kind for her sister. This is such a mass story, it's so embarrassing. Anyway, Shaman and I got an apartment with an oven. It wasn't very big, but it felt comfortable there. And that's where my phone rang when you called me all those times. So that's the end of chapter 15. We will start with the rest of the chapters later. See, I've already finished almost half of the book, so it's gonna be no big deal finishing all of it. Just excited to get this done with as well. Meet you soon. Bye bye.